diapers, blankets, and relief kits to some of the more than 500,000 Syrians who have flooded across the border into Jordan. And I'll just show you a few pictures here. This picture is of Dr. Kabashi. She was doing a lecture for the Syrian women who were receiving the infant milk powder. There are two issues that international agencies worry about in distributing milk powder. One is that it will be mixed with impure water and it will harm the children. And the other is that the women will use it as a substitute for breastfeeding instead of a supplement. And so she was talking with the women about the best way to use the milk. It was always very difficult to take pictures of adults, but we could usually photograph the children. These are some of the 20,000 or so relief kits that NCC shipped into the. These buckets contain towels and basic hygiene supplies. One of the things we were really impressed with Caritas Jordan and the way that they responded was their emphasis on respecting the dignity of each of the refugees. When you're a refugee, there are very few things in life that are under your control. And Caritas made a point of allowing the refugees to select the color of blanket that they like best. They made a point of just talking with the refugees and hearing their stories. Zaatari refugee camp that you hear a lot about in the news is in the middle of a high-altitude desert that is cold and wet in the winter and stiflingly hot sandstorms in the summer. Newcomers live in tents. Eventually, families are moved into small one-room caravans. Zaatari camp was opened in July 2012 and is already the fifth largest city in Jordan. The main street of the camp is packed with pedestrians and lined with vendors selling fruits, vegetables, household supplies, and even washing machines. And I have some pictures here of the camp. Some were taken by a friend from the Jordan Times and some were that I took. This was preparation for winter last year. It really gets very cold, as you can see from the clothing. And you'll see it again that most of the pictures are children because adults did not want to generally be photographed unless they were quite elderly. They would usually allow it. Water is a huge issue in Jordan. One of the sources of great tension between the refugees and the host communities in Jordan is that for a time, refugees at Zaatari camp were consuming more water than the local Jordanians were getting. We were told that the children in the camp enjoy doing dishes because it gives them a chance to play with the water.
You've got mail.
88-year-old Omar came to Zaatari from Daryl in late 2012, along with two grown sons who carried her across the border and a gaggle of grandchildren. Daryl is where Syria's revolution began in March of 2011. When 15 young Syrian boys were arrested for painting graffiti about Syria's President Bashar al-Assad. And I think their message was something like, "You're next, Doc." Omar welcomed us in her 10 by 15-foot caravan, which had no furnishings except mats on the floor. She served us tea along with heaping plates of bananas and oranges. Omar's grandchildren do not go to school at the camp because there is a lot of social unrest in the camp, and the schools are quite a distance from where their caravan is located. So many of the residents are not in easy, accessible walking distance to medical facilities or other services in the camp. Her son, Omar, fears the Syrian regime might fire Scud missiles at Zafri because the camp is so close to the Syrian border. Another refugee spoke with was Salwa. She's from Homs, where some of the most intense fighting happened in the early days of the Civil War. In early 2012, after two neighbors in Homs were killed, and her husband's grocery store was taken over by the Syrian security forces, she fled with her husband and four small children to Mafraq in northern Jordan. In order to get out of Syria, Salwa and her husband told the border officials that their small children needed a break from the violence, and they promised that they would return to Syria after 15 days. They arrived in Jordan with only the clothes that they were wearing at the time. Like many families, Salwa's children arrived in Jordan carrying trauma with them. And you can see the trauma on the faces of the children when you would visit with them. Whenever, even now in Jordan, the children hear fireworks or gunshots, which are common when there's a wedding celebration, they fear that the violence has followed them from Syria to Jordan. Salwa told me that she could have never imagined that her government would turn on its own people. And she expressed her feeling, and there were a diverse view of perspectives that were expressed. But she expressed her feeling that Assad is motivated by fear of a Sunni takeover in Syria. I asked Salwa what message she would want to share with people in the West. Her swift reply was, "Please do not forget the Syrian people." Gadir, which is not really her name, or mother of Gadir, is a Sunni Muslim woman from Aleppo. She made the harrowing 300-mile journey from northern Syria to Amman with her husband and four children after their home in Aleppo was destroyed in the fighting. They had spent nearly 10 years putting together their savings to build the home, and 6 months after it was completed, it was destroyed. Gadir is an urban refugee. Indeed, 75% of the Syrians in Jordan are urban refugees. Most of them don't actually live in the camps. Gadir's family of 6 lives in a one-room flat in one of the poorer neighborhoods in Amman. Her husband sells clothing, earning approximately $125 a month. The rent for their one-bedroom flat was $100 a month. When we visited earlier this year, Gadir's daughter, 7-year-old daughter, Gadir, served as tea. This is 3 of the 4 children. Gadir was one of the Syrians who was not as interested in siding with either the Assad government or the rebel groups. She simply wanted the violence to stop so that she and her family could return to Aleppo to begin to rebuild their home. Well, that's just a bit of the background of the kinds of stories that we encountered over the last 2 years. President Obama's recent call for limited military strikes against the Syrian government has received, in my judgment, a fairly tepid response in the United States and abroad. My own read is that many in the United States are exhausted by war. According to the National Priorities Project, during the past 12 years, the United States has spent nearly $1.5 trillion to execute wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. $657 billion of that for Afghanistan, $814 billion for Iraq. That's an average of $11.3 million per hour since 2001. 11.3, and I'm sorry, that's probably not big enough to read unless you're up here on my history, but $11.3 million per hour for the last 12 years. In addition to that financial cost, more than 6,650 American men and women in uniform have died in these 2 wars, along with at least 3,000 private contractors working for the U.S. tens of thousands of uniformed Afghans and Iraqis, at least 16,700 Afghan civilians, and at least 123,000 Iraqi civilians have also been killed in the violence. So there's a large human cost of these wars. Not counting the cost of the Afghanistan and Iraqi wars, the U.S. military budget for the fiscal year that will end at the end of this month is $527 billion. The President has proposed, but it has not yet been approved, a budget for the coming year, which is about the same amount. According to the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, in 2012, the United States accounted for 41% of the world's military spending. The U.S. spends 6 times the amount that China spends annually, 11 times what the Russians spend, and 27 times what the Iranians spend. Just yesterday, the UN weapons inspectors released their report, which concluded that the nerve gas sarin was used against civilians on a relatively large scale in the suburbs of Damascus on August 21st. The report did not say whether chemical weapons were used by the Assad government or by rebel groups, and so that has become the discussion today. The United States, France, and the UK argue that only the Assad government would have had access to the amount of chemical agents that were used for such large-scale attacks. Russia counters that if it was the rebel groups who used the chemical weapons, and points to the fact that if the Syrian government had actually used the nerve agent sarin, rebel soldiers would have been among the victims, which was not the case. I want to be clear, as Michael was, that if subsequent evidence shows that the Assad government knowingly used chemical weapons against the Syrian people, Assad and his top military advisors should be held accountable. The same would be true of rebel groups. It's unacceptable for anyone to use these terrible weapons. But based on what I heard and observed during the past 6 years in the Middle East, I have serious reservations whether military strikes would end up achieving the U.S. objective of sending a strong message to the Iranians and saying that crossing a red line is unacceptable. Thankfully, as Adria mentioned at the beginning, the talk in recent days has been of a joint effort to disarm Syria's chemical weapons program. Still, the threat of U.S. military force is a backup plan, so I don't know if we're completely out of the woods on this one. In my judgment, there are significant problems with going the military route. First, most likely, military strikes would harm innocent civilians. Modern warfare almost always includes so-called collateral damage. We saw frequent news stories in the Middle East media about collateral damage from unarmed U.S. drone strikes in Pakistan and Afghanistan. These stories do not bode well for the U.S. image abroad. Secondly, U.S. military strikes would undermine the opportunity for a more positive engagement with Iran. The new Iranian President, Hassan Rouhani, and his foreign minister have both indicated a new openness to constructively engage with the United States. A U.S. military strike would make it very awkward for President Rouhani because the hardliners in Iran would gain the upper hand in saying that you can't go soft on the U.S. Third, military strikes could draw the U.S. into another protracted war. President Obama has promised that strikes would be limited and that there would be no boots on the ground. But what if Syria and its allies respond by targeting Israel or even U.S. personnel in the region? Once the military genie is out of the bottle, we do not control the response of others in the region. The region is already in a fragile state. Introducing more weapons seems like an unlikely recipe for calming a highly volatile situation. The International Peace and Security Institute last week published a letter signed by 28 of the nation's leading peace-building academics calling for alternatives to military strikes. They wrote, "Research in our field suggests that interventions to support one side of a conflict prolong wars by 50%. So it actually extends the war to have the international intervention on one side. The fourth caution I have about military strikes is that they would play into the dominant Middle Eastern image of the United States as a trigger-happy country that selectively respects international law, human rights, and democracy. During our 6 years in the Middle East, we heard many complaints about what is perceived as inconsistent U.S. behavior, and that behavior is driven by these very things that Mike talked about. If there are strategic interests that often will trump our rhetoric about democracy, human rights, and international law. I remember very well traveling into Iran in 2007 and meeting with a young student from Tehran University. And he said, "I just don't understand your people. Can you help me understand this?" He said, "You know, when there is a disaster in the U.S. like Hurricane Katrina, it seems like you all rally around and help each other. What I can't understand is why is your country always going to war?" And that is a common image. There is rightly a perception that the U.S. has supported dictatorships when it's in our strategic interest to do so, that we selectively recognize democratically elected governments, and that there is a double standard in whether we call for the recognition of UN Security Council resolutions or whether we ignore them. In the case of Arab governments, the U.S. is often on the side of enforcing the resolutions. When it comes to enforcing UN resolutions about the Israeli occupation of the West Bank or the expansion of settlements, we overlook those resolutions in the perception of the region. So what are the alternatives to military strikes if that issue does in fact come back on the table, which it may well do? I mentioned several. One is, I think we would do well to invest more of our national resources into research about nonviolent ways of responding to sticky global conflicts. We have invested so much of our national treasure into developing the world's most powerful military that perhaps we have lost any creative edge for imagining alternatives. I'm sure most of you have heard the expression that every tool in your toolbox is a hammer. All the world's problems look like nails. I spoke to a member of the U.S. Army over the past weekend who told me there are some occasions where a hammer is needed, but there is a cost every time you swing the hammer. What would happen if, as a nation, we transferred 10% of the Pentagon's budget to the U.S. Institute for Peace for research into nonviolent responses to global conflicts? Currently, the U.S. Institute for Peace receives an annual budget of $39.5 million, which is less than 1/1000th of the Pentagon's budget. A second, alternatively, is to seriously work collaboratively with other nations to resolve conflicts. Initially, in this case, President Obama announced plans for military strikes against Syria even before the UN weapons inspectors had completed their study and their report. This kind of act-alone behavior suggests that we don't respect international institutions or international processes, and it doesn't garner good feelings for the people of this country. And I applaud President Obama for later choosing negotiations with Russia to come up with a plan for dismantling Syria's chemical weapons, but that came after this initial impulse to act alone. This would be also a perfect opportunity for the Obama administration to reach out to the new Iranian president, urging him to pressure the Syrian government to follow through with its commitment to surrender its chemical weapons. Indeed, some of the press reports this week have noted a recent exchange of letters between Presidents Obama and Rouhani that may well set the stage for the first face-to-face encounter between an American and an Iranian president since the 1979 Islamic Revolution in Iran. Third, as I mentioned in the Richmond Times piece, the importance of using culturally appropriate means to address bad behavior. Now, there is disagreement about whether how much influence honor and shame would carry with President Assad, but the idea is to think about what are some of the culturally appropriate ways that people honor good behaviors and express displeasure with bad behaviors. And I was suggesting that inviting the Arab media to broadly expose the stories of children and civilians who were killed by chemical attacks as a way of placing shame on perpetrators. Fourth, prosecute war crimes in the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court is governed by the Rome Statute. It's the first permanent treaty-based international criminal court established to help end impunity for the perpetrators of the most serious crimes of concern to the international community. Now, I'm well aware of the challenges to bringing this case before the ICC. Joshua Keating, an international affairs writer for Slate, notes that Syria is not a state party to the ICC, and therefore its prosecutors don't have jurisdiction over crimes committed there. For Assad to be charged in the ICC, he would have to be referred by the UN Security Council, which, as with an authorization for military intervention, isn't going to happen as long as Russia and China have seats. But Mark Lynch counters that there actually is a legal argument for involving ICC even if the Security Council stays blocked. And that argument rests in the fact that Syria, unlike Libya, is a signatory to the Treaty of Rome, even if it has not acceded to the court. So as a signatory to this treaty, it does have some responsibilities which could include not owning or possessing weapons of mass destruction. So the basic point in that argument is simply that there are international tribunals. They are set up to prosecute crimes against humanity, war crimes, and let's use those. Let's respect those institutions. Lastly, I would say that one of the most significant strategies for the U.S. is to learn what it means to be a better global neighbor. Michael did a very good job of outlining how it is that Western powers tend to make decisions based on strategic, economic, and political interests. And we are not seen broadly as being a good example of democracy or support for human rights or international law. And indeed, it's increasingly difficult for people in the Middle East to see or to hear the U.S. talk about democracy when our own Congress can't get its act together we have become so polarized as a country that we are not giving a model to the world of what it looks like to discuss differences in a civil way and to come out with solutions that are seen to benefit the common good of the nation. The Syrian conflict has become immensely more complex in the past 2 years. It started as a simple uprising against what was seen as a fairly brutal response to these 15 young men in Daryl. Today, there are multiple international actors engaged in the conflict in Syria. What is needed to bring this conflict to a close is an inclusive process that brings together all the players and which addresses the historical roots of this conflict and offers an opportunity for restoring relationships across the different political and ethnic and religious lines. The recent negotiations between Russia and the United States offer a glimmer of hope that international collaboration is possible for not only resolving the chemical weapons issue, but for resolving the underlying civil war that's plagued the Syrian people for more than 2 years now. And I would argue that those of us who would place ourselves in the peace camp have not yet convinced the majority of the U.S. populace that nonviolent methods can work to transform conflicts or to deal with difficult dictators. But for the first time in at least a generation, we have a window of opportunity to make that case. People are skeptical about using more violence than what they do. And my hope is that we will not miss that opportunity for the sake of this country and for the sake of the children of Syria.